Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our Insights program. This evening, we're honored to have Assistant Professor Alan Mislove from the College of Computer Information Science here at Northeastern. And today he's going to present Social Media and Networks, Bridging the World Together, One Click at a Time. Professor Alan Mislove received his PhD as well as his master and undergrad from Rice University. And then following that, he joined the Northeastern staff, which is terrific. And in the summer of 2005, he was an intern at Microsoft Research in Cambridge, UK. And in 2011, he was a recipient of the NSF Career Award. He was recently a postdoctoral researcher as well at Max Planck Institute for Software Systems. And a little tidbit I found out from Professor Mislove during our conversation that he had a chance to go to Germany with his professor, Peter Driscoll, where they founded the new Max Planck Institute for Software Systems. Professor Mislove's interest lies in glassnots and e-posts, just to name a few. He also works with social networks, distributed systems, and network measurement tools. At this time, I would like to welcome Professor Mislove.
So thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Okay. I guess I got two mics, so I'm good to go. So first off, I wanted to thank the Alumni Office as well as Reha for the very kind introduction, and thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and hear me talk. So my goal today really is to talk about the research that's going on within my group at Northeastern, but my underlying goal is actually not really to talk about the specific contributions we've made, but talk about why I think the area of social media and networks is an interesting area and one that's going to produce fruitful research both now and years into the future. So I'm not going to go into too much technical detail, but if you have technical questions, feel free to ask them afterwards. But instead, I'll be more motivating why the problems we're looking at, I think, are the problems that are really interesting, and why the solutions we're coming up with are the ones that are right for these sorts of problems. So I'm going to run this a little bit like I run my classes, and I recognize a few of my students out there who are taking my class right now, and they know I like a very interactive lecture. So if any of you have any questions at any time, if you don't understand something, you have a follow-up question, anything, please just raise your hand or just speak out. Don't hesitate. I'd rather have a much more interesting discussion, and I'll skip some of the slides at the end. Okay? So, and I might even call on you, so be careful. Yes. Oh, this, yes, important. Okay, so I'm going to start my talk by asking, what is social media? What do I mean? And it's something that you hear a lot about in news reports and on blogs and so forth. And it's not really well defined. And so I want to sort of give you an idea of what I mean when I say social media. And essentially, the way I view social media is any system where user interaction is a critical component. Okay? And this is a very broad view of social media. This includes sort of what traditional social media sites like Facebook, MySpace, or could. This is really like online communities. As well as other communication systems like Skype and instant messaging, constant content sharing systems like Flickr or YouTube, as well as social news media sites like blogs or iReports or Twitter, and even online worlds. These are games like World of Warcraft or virtual worlds like Second Life. Okay? And what distinguishes these systems, again, is that they're driven by user interaction. Users contributing content, users sending messages to each other, users generating the content that the site provides. And so before I really get into the meat of the talk, I want to take a step back and look at to what extent social media has changed our society and how I see that happening over the past, say, 5 to 10 years. And so what I did when I was putting together this talk is I went back and I looked at a company called Alexa. And they're sort of an informatics company that they rate the most popular websites in terms of web traffic. And so I went back and looked at what were the most popular sites about 10 years ago in 2002. And so I looked at the top 10. A number of these are, say, Korean sites or Japanese sites, but I looked at the ones that were US-centric. And I pulled sort of the most interesting 5 out from 2002. And these include sites like Yahoo and MSN. If you remember MSN, it's a content aggregator very much in the vein of Yahoo. And additionally, Google, CNN, and even Microsoft.com was one of the top 10 sites back in 2002. So I guess people were fixing their computers or something like that. Okay? And then I pulled the same rating from today, Alexa's top 10 most popular website list. And what you'll see is that Google is still there. Now, Google today is very different than Google of 10 years ago. Google of today isn't just search, it's Gmail, GChat, Orkut, you name it, any number of sites. But then also in the top 10 are Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Blogspot, right? So even today, these are some of the most popular websites. They're a significant fraction of internet traffic. And they've really transformed our society. What they've done is they've reduced the barriers to communication. They've made it even easier for users to communicate. And as a result, they've democratized content publication. What I mean by that is today, you as an end user can go, upload a video to YouTube, and it can be viewed by millions of others at no cost to you, which is something that is simply astounding, right? If you think about it, even 10 years ago, the only people who could have something viewed by millions of users were people who had the funds to be able to support that. And now you can do that as an average end user, right, in just 10 years. And so if you start asking, well, what's interesting from a computer scientist perspective, right? When I design systems, and in grad school I spent a number of years building peer-to-peer systems, very technical work, we like to ignore the users, right? We're more comfortable with programs, we know how they work, we can evaluate them. And as a result, we like to just sort of ignore the fact that they're actually humans using this on the end, right? But I'm going to argue that with social media, you can no longer do that. That we as computer scientists, the people who are building these systems, we have to have an understanding of how the users are interacting and what that means. So I want to give you an argument for why that is the case. So these sites are not, if you look at they're incredibly popular. For example, Facebook recently has over 800 million users. But the reason why you can't ignore the users, if you look at the amount of content that is being shared on these sites. It's, for example, Facebook alone receives over 8 billion new photos uploaded every month. That's a statistic that's about a year old. And YouTube alone receives 48 hours of video uploaded every minute. So to run these sorts of sites, you have to be able to organize this information, search this information, and find relevant information. For example, which Facebook photos should I be viewing? So there's a number of technical issues associated with that. But when we start thinking about how this content is organized, I'm going to argue that it's very different than any previous system. So what I want to do here is compare social media sites and the way that information is organized on social media sites to the classic web. So I think about basically the web in 2002 and the web in 2012 as a rough guess, as a rough estimate. Okay? So let's think about the way the web is organized. Well, how many of you are familiar with how Google is able to find useful pages? A few people? So for those of you who are not familiar, essentially, the classic web was viewed as a collection of web pages, and they have links from one page to another. Okay? And so this link is an endorsement of some sorts. It means one page is saying, hey, this is a good site. So I might put a link on my home page to say Larry's homepage, saying Larry is the dean, and there's a relationship between our two pages. Now, what Google's insight was back in 1998 when Google started was that this graph contains more information than just the links between pages. In fact, if you look at the graph and you say, aha, pages that have a large number of incoming links are important, meaning a lot of people are voting on those pages. They're endorsing that page. And thus, that should be an important page. This is called PageRank, and this is what Google uses to be able to find important pages. And in fact, what it means is that just by looking at this graph, I can figure out that this page is important. For example, the New York Times is an important page without even knowing what page is what. Okay? So that's sort of the classic web, and that's how we find useful pages in the classic web. But now let's switch over and talk about social media. What does it look like? Well, first off, the content that's shared on social media is different than the classic web. It's not web pages. When you go to Facebook, you aren't uploading a web page. What you're uploading are end-user generated content. These are photos, videos, status updates, likes, and so forth. And so it doesn't look anything like this. The photos you upload to Facebook don't link to another photo, at least in the same way that web pages link to another web page. Instead, what the photos link to are users, right? These are users who appear in the photo, the user who uploads the photo, users who comment on the photo, and so forth, right? You have a link, for example, from the photo to the user accounts who are somehow associated with that photo. And now what's holding this whole network together is the social network, right? That's how we're able to navigate this network. That's how we're able to find information. So this shows why in social media, users are an integral part of the system. We have to have an understanding of how users are sharing content and how users are connecting together to be able to find information in these systems. Okay? So hopefully I've convinced you that social media is something new. And this is the thesis that's really underlying my group's research. The fact that social media is different on a very fundamental level than the classic web. And as a result, we need new ways that this change is introducing new challenges, right? The shift from the classic web to social media. And as a result, we need new techniques to be able to address these challenges. And that's essentially what my research agenda is, and my group's research agenda. So what I'm going to talk to you about today for the rest of the talk is 3 examples of changes that are caused by the shift from the classic web to social media and how we're addressing those challenges, okay? And each one of these is driven by an effect of the shift from the classic web to social media. So I'll motivate each one by a change and describe how we're addressing it. Okay? So are there any questions at this point? Nobody? Hope you're enjoying your dinner. Okay, cool. All right, so we'll go ahead and sort of dive in a little bit, I guess. Yeah. Okay, so the first of the 3 is driven by changes that are happening to the patterns of content creation and exchange. And so what I mean by that is we're going to look at how content on the internet is being distributed. So I'm going to take a step back and give a little bit of background on how the internet is structured so you can appreciate what this change is and what it means. Okay? And so for those of you who aren't intimately familiar with how the internet works, at a high level, you can imagine it as a collection of entities. Entities like AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, and Time Warner. Okay? So generally large companies. They run lots of routers and switches and so forth. And you as an end user, when you connect to the internet, effectively what you're doing is you're contracting with one of these entities. For example, you at home may be contracting with Comcast. Okay? Now, when you contract, you generally don't contract directly with, say, the AT&Ts of the world. Instead, you buy internet service from some company who buys internet service from a bigger company, sort of all the way up the chain. And so in general, the network, you can view the network as having a center, which is these big, large corporations, and an edge, which is your home machine or my cell phone or so forth. So like very fast links out here and the slower links out towards the edge. Okay? It's sort of at a very high level, this is what the internet looks like. Now, let's look at what happens in the classic web. Well, what did we do? We went to sites like CNN and Microsoft and so forth. So I'm going to take New York Times as an example. So generally, they're a large corporation, and they have a very good internet connection. Generally, they're connected directly to the center of this network. Okay? So I'm sort of showing them it connected to AT&T. Now, in the classic web, when you'd go to NewYorkTimes.com, what would happen is your web browser would send a request that would go through the internet and be routed to New York Times, and then New York Times would send you back their homepage, including all the images and the video and whatever else they had in there. Okay? Now, if you're a computer scientist, you look at this and you say, well, that's somewhat unfortunate, right? Because what's happening? Well, this link between AT&T and Time Warner is being used to send the same content twice, right? I mean, the homepage of New York Times doesn't change from one user to another, at least to a certain extent, right? So, years ago, there were companies that noticed this and said, aha, well, what if I did the following? What if I put a server here in your ISP, in one of these corporations, and then instead of going all the way across the internet to fetch the content, instead, we'd automatically intercept it here, and it'd serve the content locally. Now, this clearly saves Time Warner money, because they don't have to pay AT&T, and it saves New York Times money, because they don't have to serve the content. Okay? So this is what's known as a content distribution network, and Akamai is one example of that, and Akamai is currently a multi-billion-dollar company. So it's a very good idea, and it works quite well. Okay? So now, the question is, what happens when the shift from the classic web to social media? So we're changing New York Times to Facebook. Now, what I'm going to argue is that there are 2 changes that are happening to the content that's being distributed. Okay, so we'll look at these 2 changes. The first of these changes is where the content is being generated. Okay? So let's think back to New York Times, right? What's the content of the New York Times? It's articles, photos taken by New York Times journalists, and so forth. All of that is generated by the New York Times itself, right? It's generated in the center of the network up here, and so it makes sense that they're pushing it out. But now think of Facebook. Where is the content being generated? At the edge, right? The content on Facebook is not generated by Facebook. Instead, it's generated by you out here, right? It's photos, it's videos, status updates that are coming out here, right? And yet the way that we're distributing it today is we send it all the way to Facebook, we upload the photo, and then when I go to view, say, Jennifer's photo, it comes back across the internet and gets delivered to me, okay? And so as a result, from the shift from the classic web to social media, we're seeing a change in the workload, right? That in the classic web, at a very high level, the workload was effectively from the center of the network, from the New York Times of the world, out to the edge, to your home machine, to your cell phone, or so forth, right? But with social media, what we're seeing is the workload is different. It's being generated by end users, right? And that's why end user generated content is very interesting, because it's very different than the types of content that are being distributed on the web, than in the classic web. Okay, so that's change number one. Let's look at change number two, which is the distribution of content popularity. Now, I have very few graphs in this talk, but this is one of them. And if you see, this is not a hard graph to understand, so I'll try to explain it. But if you have questions, please ask. Okay? So when I talk about content popularity, what I care about is we've got a set of images, let's say, and I care about which of the images are getting the most hits, the most views. Okay? And so what I've done in this graph is along the x-axis, I've represented all of the documents, all of the images or the tweets or the New York Times web pages, whatever you care about. And along the y-axis, I've represented the cumulative fraction of the hits those documents receive. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Take this green point right here. What this green point means is that the top 10% of the documents get 40% of the hits. Okay? So what you'll see is, for example, let's suppose we had a system where every document was equally popular. Everything got 2 hits, or everything got 10 hits. What this would look like is this, a perfectly even distribution. The top 10% of documents got 10% of the hits. 20% got 20%, 50% got 50%. Okay, everybody with me so far? All right, so the question is, what does this look like in the classic web? Any guesses? Okay. I'll spoil the surprise. All right. So in the classic web, you see curves like this. What that means is there's a small fraction of the documents that get a huge fraction of the hits. Okay? This explains why Akamai is a multi-billion-dollar company, right? Because if they can keep track of this small number of documents on that server locally in Time Warner, then they can serve 50% of the hits, save lots of money, right? And people have done studies of the classic web, and they show that this holds consistently. But now let's compare what happens, say, on Facebook. What does it look like? Well, it looks something like this. It's much closer to the even distribution. The way to think about this is, if you look at the popularity of websites, there are certain websites that are extremely popular, New York Times, CNN, and so forth. But if you look at the distribution of popularity of photos on Facebook, there isn't a photo that's as popular, relatively, as the New York Times is as a website. And the reason for that is that content in social media is of very local scope, meaning it's just of interest to you and your friends, right? There isn't something like the New York Times of Facebook photos, right? And so the implication of this is that systems like Akamai and other content distribution systems like web caching, if you're familiar with that, don't work nearly as well on sites like Facebook. Because the content, you don't have that nice popularity distribution. Instead, things are much more even, and they're most likely of interest just to you and your friends. Very local scope to content. Okay? So what I've told you is that there actually our change in workload from the classic web to social media has 2 problems, in a sense. And today, we're still using these centralized architectures to distribute our content. Right? We're still sending the photo all the way to California and sending it back. Even though the distribution of, say, Facebook photos is one of the most naturally decentralized workloads. Why? Because the people I'm sharing my photo with are likely to be in Boston. Why am I shipping this thing all the way to California when the people are, say, right around me? Okay? So the first project we're looking at is motivated by these trends. And we're building a system called LipCloud, where effectively what it does is it tries to decentralize content distribution. What I mean by that is, let's suppose you're running a website, and two people come to your website. Today, you serve the content to one, you serve the content to the other, right? And you pay for both of those. In our system, what you're trying to do is if two people come to your website, the first person you give the content to, but the second one can get it from the first. Right? And if you're running this on a site like Facebook, where there's a lot of geographic locality, meaning if two people come to our website, they're likely to be from the same place, then this saves everybody money. It's much more efficient, saves Facebook money, saves your ISP money. Okay? There's a lot of technical challenges involved with this in making a web browser serve content, especially doing it in a way that the users don't notice that there's anything different, and making it work with web browsers because you're not going to go download something to make this happen. Okay? I'm going to leave those details, feel free to ask me about them afterwards. Okay? And so, in brief, the way it works, again, is when you're distributing content, we don't send it all the way across the internet. Instead, the content stays local within your internet service provider. Okay? Now, I'm going to show you one slide of results to show that this actually works, which is how many of you have heard of the site called Etsy? Etsy.com. It's a website that independent designers and so forth can go and list their content. So we got the Akamai logs from Etsy. Etsy is a very large website. They're the top 50 website, I think, in the US today. And they use Akamai, that multi-billion-dollar company, to distribute their content. They pay a lot of money to do that. And so we got their Akamai logs, and we look at 1 week of accesses to Etsy. This is what you see. Now, Etsy is a US-centric site, meaning most of their customers come in the US. And so over the course of a week, you see these nice diurnal patterns. Traffic peaks during the day, and then it goes off at night. Okay? We simulated what would happen if we deployed our system to Etsy, and you'd see a 76% reduction in their bandwidth. Okay? That's real money, because they usually pay based on their 95th percentile bandwidth. Okay? So this is just to show you that this is practical. We've actually built this and deployed it, and it would save corporations money based on the way it works. Okay? So just to summarize this section, again, we were motivated by the change in the workload, the fact that social media is different, and we're still using centralized architectures today to distribute content. And so we've built a system that works with the web browsers of today and the websites of today and would save people money. Okay? If you have any questions about it, yes?
Well, what have you thought at all about the content that would be appropriate to this kind of model in the context of hacking, and if
Yes.
content is being shared like this, people would be getting.
Yes. So effectively, one thing you're worried about here is that since Facebook isn't giving you the content, how do I know you're getting the right content?
Right.
Is that sort of what you're asking?
Yeah.
Perfect. That's a great question. And so we actually have a technique called content hashing that I'm happy to talk about offline. But essentially, we can immediately detect that if you've been sent forged content, and then you just ignore it. Right? That makes sense. So I'm happy to talk about it offline if you have any questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are you saying this content resides on all the local edge devices?
It's cached at the local edge devices. So your web browser keeps a copy of it.
So someone's cell phone web browser will keep some of this content and send it over to somebody else in his room?
So we are not targeting mobile for this. We've actually deployed this and built an iPhone app that does this, so it does work and it doesn't impact your battery life significantly. But it's unclear whether with the data plans that exist in mobile, whether that's what you'd want to do. So I'm targeting more desktops, say your home connections or so forth. Right. But your intuition is correct in that, let's suppose I'm sharing content with you if we're friends on Facebook. We're both in Boston. You go to ask it from Facebook. Facebook says, hey, you can get it from Alan. And I send it to you directly.
But it's still going on the local ISP?
Yeah, it's still going within the local ISP, but they don't pay money to anybody else.
Okay.
Yeah. I think there's a question here and then there. Yeah.
How do you deal with copyrights and laws?
Can you say that again?
How do you deal with copyrights and laws?
Copyrights. I would argue this doesn't really change. I mean, so the content that you're distributing is content that Facebook or say whoever was deploying this would have distributed anyway.
But you signed up an agreement with Facebook to allow them to have your photos.
Yes.
I haven't signed an agreement with anybody else.
Well, but these are people who could access the photo anyway. So you're only going to distribute content that you could access anyway.
But they're redistributing it to other people.
But that redistribution was happening regardless. So it's just the only thing that's changing in this system is where you're getting the content from.
I could possibly answer that. If
Yeah.
you're a photographer, if you copyright something, it's still yours. That's the law, and they might be able to distribute it. If you just send it to the copyright office, get the form and everything, and you'll be all set.
Yeah.
But if you put yourself out there, people are gonna copy it. But still, to protect yourself, you want to always, before you put something on any site, you want to copyright it yourself.
But-
Yeah, I'm more talking about redistribution.
Yeah. Why don't we take this offline? I'm not a lawyer, so I certainly can't comment on the legal issues associated with that. I think it was here and there.
So what you're doing is it's your content, right? And you're holding it, and then you're distributing. I mean, basically,
Yes.
everything you're posting.
Yes. Not necessarily only that, but yes. You're right. It could be, so the idea is that your web browser has a cache right now, and so you're just, whatever happens to be in your cache, you're able to distribute to others. Okay, mostly it's your content, but it could be, say, your friends on Facebook. Right. I think there's a question there.
So is that similar to like a private cloud concept where
Yeah.
you have like, I'm Jeff, I have 200 friends, I can share my pictures and content with other people, but people on the outside can't see.
Yes, exactly.
Like in Facebook, some friends make their
Yeah.
photos private, they're all private. They're
Yes.
not part of that private cloud that you are with your friends.
Yes, exactly. And this doesn't change the access patterns or anything like that. And one way to view this is essentially Facebook is taking, if they deploy this, would be taking advantage of the resources provided by the visitors to its website, right? It's having the users who visit the website help distribute the content to others. Okay. Let me take one additional question, and then I'll push the rest on this section to the end. Yeah, go ahead.
Does the benefit kind of change with a walled garden environment like Facebook versus a broadcast environment like YouTube, where you might not necessarily, the people viewing the content might not necessarily be your friends in the case of YouTube?
So I'll point out, it doesn't change, for example, Etsy is not a social network in the way that Facebook is a social network. The content's still generated at the edge, so it falls under my definition of social media. And in fact, there it's even better. And the reason is that it's closer to the classic web in terms of content popularity, so you're more likely to find somebody who has the content you're looking for, right?
Okay.
So I can show you some graphs to take it off, but yeah. But your intuition is correct. It's actually better in non-walled garden than it is in walled garden. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and move on, but again, keep asking questions. This is fun. Okay. So the second effect, again, we're talking about the change from classic web to social media, is what it means to have an account, or what an identity means on these sites. Okay? So let me take a step back and ask, well, what do we mean when we say a user account? Okay? Traditionally, what this means, account is really an encapsulation of privileges. Okay? So when you have an account, say on your work machine, or on, say your email server or something like that, what it means is you have the right to do certain things. Okay? And traditionally, accounts were verified by the people who own the machine, right? So say 10 or 15 years ago, the way you would get an account on whatever machine, you would go to the administrator, show some ID, and then they would give you an account and a login and give you privileges. Okay? But we're seeing a change here, which is that on social media sites like Gmail, Facebook, YouTube, whatever, accounts are now free. Okay? The only thing you have to have to sign up for an account on most of these sites is an email address. And email addresses are free. So effectively, accounts are free. And the problem is that these accounts still come with privileges. Okay? So for example, on Gmail, you're allowed to send email if you have an account. On Facebook, you can upload content. And on sites like TripAdvisor or Yelp or so forth, you can vote. So what do you think we're seeing? We're seeing what are called Sybil attacks, okay, in the literature. What it is, it's very simple. One user creates multiple accounts, right? And I would argue that this is very natural, because if you have multiple accounts, you have a disproportionate amount of privileges. For example, let's suppose you had a favorite business on Yelp. You create 5 different accounts, and you can vote 5 times now, right? And we've seen this happening on many different sites. For example, there's a lot of this going on sites like TripAdvisor and Yelp, because having a very good rating drives drives users to come to your business. And so we see people creating fake accounts, manipulating the ratings to try to make businesses either appear very good or try to make your competitors appear very bad, right? And so I'm going to focus on this problem, and I'm going to focus on it somewhat narrowly for the moment, on online marketplaces. Okay? These are sites like eBay, Overstock Auctions, or so forth. Okay? These are among some of the most successful websites. eBay alone, I think, had $62 billion in goods sold last year, or 2010. But they're known to suffer from fraud. The first thing that you might have thought of when I said the word eBay was, oh, I'm staying away, right? So how many of you have used eBay? So a good number. Okay, so if you've used eBay, the question is, you'll go to the site and you'll say searching for an iPad, right? And you search for iPad and hundreds and hundreds of listings come up, and they're all basically the same price. So the question is, what do you use to figure out who you should buy from? Because you don't want to buy from the guy who's not going to ship you the iPad, right? What you use is something called the feedback profile, okay? So essentially what that is when you participate in a transaction on eBay, and the other person you participate with is allowed to provide feedback on you, okay? So for example, if I'm this red user, I have a feedback profile from, feedback containing from other users saying, Alan's a good guy, he sent my item, or he sent my money, and so forth, okay? So what happens when we have a Sybil attack on eBay? Well, what you see is the red user, for example, can create multiple accounts. And again, eBay doesn't know that these red accounts are all owned by the same user. And you, as if you're buying something from the red guy, you don't know that he owns multiple accounts, okay? So what he can do then is list an item with one of his accounts and buy it with the other, okay? And we see this happening. And of course, he provides himself good feedback, right? And so as a result, he pays the transaction fee to eBay, and then he has a very positive profile. He's more likely to sell his goods for more money. And of course, what he can do is create a good reputation, list a whole bunch of iPads, take people's money, and then go away. Okay? And in fact, he can create a whole nother account, start from scratch, and keep doing this. Okay? So the question is, how do we address this problem? Now, one way you could address this is prevent Sybil attacks by requiring people to show their passport. What's called strong identities. But the problem is eBay is not going to do that. Right? They want users to be very easy to sign up. They want users to be able to come to their site very easily. So what we've developed is something we call Bazaar, which is a new approach to addressing Sybil attacks in online marketplaces. And it doesn't change the model of eBay. Meaning, with Bazaar, we still assume that you can have as many accounts as you want. And in fact, you can create fake transactions to your heart's content between these accounts. But we're still able to prevent fraud. So I'll give you a high-level description for how it works, but feel free to ask questions if you have any technical questions about it, okay? And so the insight Bazaar uses to work is that successful transactions between two users represent shared risk. So let's suppose I buy something from Jennifer, okay? Now, she's risking that I might provide her negative feedback. Even if she ships the item, I might cause her negative feedback, and as soon as you have any negative feedback in your profile, you're impacted greatly. People will stay away from you, okay? Now, I'm risking that she won't ship me the item. Right? I'm paying her money, okay? So what we build is something called a risk network, which is essentially links between identities who have successfully shared risk in the past. So if I buy something from Jennifer, I'm happy, then we have a link that's for $10. So eBay simply keeps track of this, okay? It has this big graph. And the question is, well, how do we use this graph to prevent fraud? Here's the insight, which is, let's suppose we have a buyer who's about to buy something from a seller in this site. Okay, we have this big graph. I've reduced it down to something simple, but imagine that this is a big graph with millions and millions of identities. Well, we know the amount that the buyer is about to purchase the item for. Say it's $10. What we calculate over this network is something called the max flow. Now, what that means is imagine that each one of these links are pipes. Okay? They can carry a certain amount of water, right? So this pipe, this is a $100 pipe, so it can carry 100 units of water. This is a $5 pipe, and it can only carry 5 units of water. Okay? What max flow captures, and the reason it's called flow, is simply how much water could the buyer push to the seller. Okay? So what's the answer in this graph? $5. Perfect. You guys agree. Okay. So the max flow between the buyer and the seller is $5. So the way our system works is we say if the max flow is lower than the amount of the transaction, we declare it to be potentially fraudulent. So you're probably asking, why does that work? What does this mean? So let's suppose that our red user was malicious, meaning he had created multiple identities, listed them like I showed you before. So what does that look like here? Well, what that looks like is he has some identities over here. And he can set the value of these links to whatever he wants, because they're fake transactions. eBay doesn't know this, but that's what he can do. What's the max flow between the buyer and the seller now? Still $5, right? And in fact, this red guy can create a whole network over there. Millions of accounts, millions of identities, fake transactions to his heart content. But the max flow is still only $5. Because how can he increase the max flow? He has to participate in a transaction with somebody over here, with one of the blue guys, the good guys. Meaning he has to provide good service to the network. Okay? So this is sort of a high-level overview for how Bazaar works. And again, if you have any questions, now would be the time. But essentially, we've evaluated this on a set of 10 million auctions from eBay UK. And in our trace, it has very low false positives, and it would have prevented over $164,000 worth of negative feedback, which we're associating with fraud, had it been deployed in only 90 days in only 5 categories. So it works on real data in practice. Okay? So I'm happy to take any questions on this one.
How does the system bootstrap itself?
Great question. So the question is, let's suppose you're a new user, right? You have no links, so you have no max flow, right? So the question is, how do you get into the network? So what you do is the bad guys are allowed to create fake transactions. So we let the good guys do that as well, right? So suppose you come to me like, hey, Alan, I want to join eBay. I'm already in it, so I have some links. I can create a virtual link to you, like a $20 link, right? And now you're part of the network and you can participate. And the reason this isn't a security attack is that when I'm doing that, I'm putting my reputation on the line, right? I'm vouching for you. And so if you're bad, I get punished. I didn't talk about how that works, but in practice, what happens is if I invite you into the network and then you steal money, I get punished as well. So I have a disincentive to allow negative users. Okay, but great question. Anything else? Yeah.
How does that invite to the network work if normally all you need is the free account?
So there's another alternative you have that I'll talk about a little bit offline, but essentially, if you don't know anybody, so if you know somebody in the network, it's easy. You just get this virtual link, right? If you don't know somebody, you can give escrow money to eBay, and then you have to sort of earn your eBay's trust in a sense, and you get your escrow money back. So as long as you don't misbehave during sort of this trial period where you're joining the network, then you get the money back, and then you're bootstrapped into the network. Okay, but I'll show you offline if you have any questions. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, and I'll go through this somewhat quickly, is the shift from the classic web to social media is causing changes to what end users have to do. And so what I mean by that is you've all heard about the debate of privacy on sites like Facebook. And the question is, well, what's underlying the debate? Why is privacy such a hot issue on Facebook? I'd argue that there's 2 reasons. There's an obvious reason and a non-obvious reason. The obvious reason is that simply, Facebook is a site that has personal data on millions of users. This has never happened before. No one entity has had so much data about what you like, what you don't like, who you communicate with, and so forth. Okay? That's the obvious reason. The non-obvious reason is that on these sites, users are expected to manage their own privacy. Okay? Meaning you control your content. When you go to Facebook, you are expected to choose who can access your content. And that's despite the fact that Facebook's privacy policy is 5,800 words long, despite the fact there are over 100 different settings that you can choose from, and despite the fact that the default, meaning if you don't do anything, is that every piece of content is shared with all 800 million Facebook users. Okay? That's the non-obvious reason. And so essentially what's going on is that in the classic web, you were just a content consumer. You browse content. You didn't upload anything, so you didn't have to manage anything. But now you're providing the content, and you're in charge of managing it, making sure that the right people are able to access your content. And this is, for every piece of content you upload, you have a choice. Who should be able to access this? Which of your friends? You have, on average, 130 friends. You're a member of 90 groups, and so forth. Right? So there's a huge number of choices, and it's a management burden. Users are having trouble keeping track of this. Okay? So what we're looking at in this study is simply what's the extent of the privacy problem. Okay? We don't quantify this, because I believe this is what's going on Facebook today, meaning users are having trouble. Right? So before I go into the details, I want to give you a background on what the Facebook model is for privacy. Okay? So by default, when you upload content to Facebook, you have 5 choices for who's able to access your content. The first of those is you can choose to only share it with yourself, right? Kind of defeats the purpose of Facebook, but you can choose that if you want, right? The second choice is some friends, some of your friends, okay? So you can choose some subset of your friends and say it's only accessible by Jennifer and Larry. Third, you can just choose all of your friends. You can choose all of your friends and their friends, or the default is all 800 million people on Facebook, okay? So what we did to measure this, to measure the difficulty that users have managing their content, is we put together a survey that's also a Facebook application. So we would simply ask users, they would log in to our survey, we would select some of their content, and then we would show them their content and ask them who should be able to access this. For example, this photo, who should be able to? We give them the same options Facebook gives them today. And we compare what they answer to what their actual setting is, looking for what fraction of the time were we right, or was the user right, okay? And so I'm going to skip over this and show you just one result before I conclude. So what this table represents is along the rows are the actual settings. This is what Facebook actually shares this with, what the users selected on Facebook. Along the columns are what they answer to our survey, meaning what they say who this content should be shared with, okay? Each one of the values here is going to be the number of content items that fall into that category, okay? So what you'll note is that anything that's marked green is shared correctly, right? Meaning the actual setting is all friends, and you answered all of my friends, okay? So if Facebook was perfect, then all of the stuff would fall into the green category. Okay, everyone with me? Cool. All right, so let's take a look at some of the numbers. So when we asked users, we asked them for about 1,600 different content items, okay? 332 of those, or 37%, fall into the green category. What that means is only 37% of the time were content items correctly shared on Facebook, okay? So now let's look at what happens when it's not correctly shared. There's two options. The first is it could be shared with too few people, meaning you've restricted it too much. You say I only want it accessible. I want it accessible to everybody in the world, but I've restricted it to all friends in practice. Okay? So those are the blue cells. The red cells are ones where it's too open, meaning you say I want to only share with my friends, but it's shared with the entire world. Okay? What you'll see is that 50% of the content falls here. 50% of the content is too open, right? And if you look at the numbers, almost all of it, when it is too open, is shared with the entire world, all 800 million Facebook users, right? And 14% of the content is too closed, okay? So I'm going to skip over some of the other results. Feel free to ask me. But our findings here is that in practice, users are having difficulty managing their content on sites like Facebook. Their content settings are correct only 36% of the time. And this is driven by the fact that they now have to be content managers. They have to keep track of their content, keep it up to date as you get new friends, and you get mad at old friends and so forth. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and stop now. I'm happy to take questions for the rest, until the program is over. But again, my group's research is motivated by this change from the classic web to social media and the effect it's having on many, many different systems and end users. I've talked about 3 of them today. There's a few other that are going on. And of course, all of this is joint work with collaborators both within Northeastern as well as outside. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.